In this slideshow, I'm going to focus on the history of screen parody with a particular emphasis on film parody, that is, parody at the movies, and why things change over the course of the 20th century, leading us up to the 1970s and the film that we're going to see, Blazing Saddles. So, as we've already seen in film history, there was a lot of imitation, a lot of copying that went on of those very short films in the beginning of the movies, because it was something easy to do to copy these little short joke films. But we also see what happened is very quickly just that sort of imitation started to be parodied, and individual films will be parodied in one way or another. What we see is that there's a kind of reflexivity that's really inherent to the parodic form. And when I say reflexivity, I mean drawing attention to the form itself. A film or a television show or some other creative work that draws attention to its own conventions and rules and its own status as a construction, rather than just trying to create a sealed environment of which we become absorbed in a narrative. Parody is all about a kind of reflexivity because it depends on our understanding of codes and the construction, and it draws attention to those and finds humor in them. So you'll remember one of the early films that we watched was called Uncle Josh at the Moving Picture Show, and that had this comic character that was watching a series of different films and interacting with those films. That's what we're talking about here. That was essentially a satire on the movies themselves and the kind of character that might go to the movies and interact with those films that he sees. But it's also copying films, though some of those were actual films, others were copies or parodies of the kinds of films that people would see. There were also, once we got into the silent era, feature-length parody films by some of the biggest stars, in particular Buster Keaton. He made a film called Go West, which was a parody of the Western. And also, his most well-known film is probably Sherlock Jr., which has a great scene in which he, who works in a movie theater as a projectionist, has a dream and he actually goes into the movie. And that movie, Sherlock Jr., is essentially a parody of Sherlock Holmes. Now, parodies were also common as shorts, whether in cartoons or actually filmed shorts. During the classical era of the 1930s and into the 1940s, they were one part of that evening's entertainment that you would see. And again, this makes sense for parody to live there and in that space. And if you think about it, going to see the movies and that experience of seeing news and B-movie and then the main feature and then some kind of cartoon, it's the perfect place to have parodies because you're referencing so many different things that are going on in the culture, and it isn't the idea that you're going to create some big feature that's going to have a big star in it. Rather, you can make reference to various things that are going on in the world or in the world of entertainment. One of the examples I had for you to watch was Bosco's Picture Show from 1933, and that's a great example of this. It has parody of well-known film characters like the Marx Brothers and others too, as well as incorporating references to things outside of the film like Hitler even. So, parody fundamentally is about not itself, but the world outside itself, and that's what constructs it, right? So we shouldn't be surprised when we see making fun not just of other similar art forms, but other things in the broader social world. In the 1930s, there are some very popular feature parodies, particularly starring the comic duo Abbott and Costello. One of the most successful was actually Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein from Universal Pictures. Universal was known for its monster movies. Those are some of the most well-known horror films ever are Universal's monster pictures, and they're also some of the most coveted movie posters that you can find. Well, Universal also had Abbott and Costello make a movie, a comedy, where they run into a variety of these different stars. So I'm going to try to play you a little bit of this. We'll see if it works. This is from the trailer to the film.
Look out, kids! Cover up! What's the matter? Cover up! Wait a minute.
The nation's top comics, Abbott and Costello, petrified but hilariously. Plus the dangerous and terrifying Wolfman, played by Lon Chaney. Plus that fiend out of a nightmare, the vampire Batman, Count Dracula, played by Bela Lugosi. Plus the most dreaded creature of them all, the Frankenstein monster, played by Glenn Strange. Plus a couple of luscious but designing females in the spookiest laugh fest on record.
It's scary. The scariest laugh fest in history. So you can see in that trailer a couple of different things, right? It makes perfect commercial sense for this studio that has successful monster movies to put all those guys together in a comedy film. Parody allows you to bring them all together. And therefore, you can combine audiences, those audiences that like comedy and those audiences that like monster movies, all together in a parody. Now, as we get into the 1950s, though, in that post-classical era of cinema, there are a lot less parodies produced. And that has to do with a couple of different things. One is the overall shift in the film industry, where they are now not experiencing such a monopoly on entertainment. They have to, as we discussed before, they're competing with television, and they don't have their theaters anymore. So there's less of a market, and one of the things that they do is they produce more blockbusters. They're trying to produce big blockbuster films rather than these parody films, which were fairly inexpensive and had a more narrow niche. So the kind of model of independent production and financing doesn't really mean that you're going to have as many parody movies as you once had. The other thing about television's existence, though, is that it's really better suited to parody than the movies are, because the format, the length of the programs is shorter. There's lots of different genres on television that parody can fit into, whether it's a sketch variety show or a talk show. And in fact, that skit-based comedy is very common on television from the very beginning because it's fairly easy to produce. And most television is live in the beginning. There's no such thing as videotape. And doing a parodic sketch, impersonating something, whether it's a movie or a TV show or a person, that is something that you can pretty easily do live with limited props. So it makes sense for it to be on TV, and people can find parody as comic entertainment on television, even if it's not in the movies the way it once was. One of the most famous examples of parody on television was Sid Caesar's program, Your Show of Shows. This is one of the most beloved shows from early television history. I've included a parody of it in the unit folder where you can watch them do a parody of another show that's pretty famous, This Is Your Life. But again, this is kind of what people expected to find on television, parody of other kinds of programs and movies. And, you know, it points to us of how comedy is, yeah, it's about making fun of things and enjoying that relief, but it's also about working through and thinking about all the culture that surrounds us in a way that other forms just don't. Rather than imitating, parody is creating that critical distance and critical difference that is pleasurable. There are still some film parodies and cartoon parodies, that is, especially, that are produced. One in particular that I hope you will watch is Duck Amuck. This is one of the all-time great parodies starring Daffy Duck, and it is self-reflexivity defined. The whole cartoon is essentially Daffy arguing with a cartoonist and getting into a battle over what he's going to look like and the powers that that cartoonist has. So this is what we mean when we talk about self-reflexivity in art and in especially parody, making fun of that apparatus, that thing that produces the culture that we see and the ways in which it's constructed, actually finding the comedy in that itself. Now, this leads us up through the 60s and into the 1970s, and what we see in the 1970s is actually a resurgence in movie parodies. That is, movies that are parodies rather than parodies of movies on television. And this is especially visible in the work of Woody Allen and Mel Brooks, both of whom were writers for Sid Caesar's Your Show of Shows. These are guys that have experience in comedy, whether in stand-up comedy or especially television comedy, writing and performing comedy on television. They then get into cinema. And guess what? The same thing that's happening is that audience that grew up on watching those shows in the 50s and 60s, that they are now teenagers and adults into the 70s, and they want to see that kind of humor, but they want to see it with a different sensibility. And what can you do in film that you can't do in TV? You can have more language, more references to sex and violence. You can have more adult content. So this audience that grew up on those TV parodies, as well as those cartoons, now is going to find them in the movies where you can have more risky content that's pushing the envelope much more than what you can do in television. So Mel Brooks, he really becomes an auteur of film parody. He has a string of genre parodies in the 70s into the 80s and 90s even that start with Blazing Saddles, the film that we're going to watch. Now, Blazing Saddles obviously is a parody of the Western genre. And in terms of its conventions, I just want to remind you what it is we usually mean when we say the Western. So the Western is almost always set between 1865 and 1890. It's a very specific time frame, and that is after the Civil War and before, or at least ending with, the expansion of the railroad across the entire United States. That's why 1890 is usually listed, because that's the time when it became much easier to travel all the way across the United States. However, many Westerns will push that into the beginning of the 20th century on up to around 1915. But most are within this very narrow 25-year range after the Civil War and up to 1890. This is the time of the quote-unquote Old West. Now, the location is usually the West, right? That means west of the Mississippi River and north of the Rio Grande. A lot of Westerns will travel along the Rio Grande as a border along the south, but often what you'll actually see is a setting that's supposed to be Texas, but in fact is filmed in Nevada or Utah or especially Arizona, that looks much more dramatic because of the mountains and the canyons and plateaus that they have there. But they'll still talk about it being Texas. It's interesting the way Texas plays this kind of role in the imagination of the West. Now, one reason for that is that the setting is not quite as important as that geography west of the Mississippi, north of the Rio Grande. It's that geography is this mythic place of the frontier, which is this dividing line between civilization and savagery. That is, it's the space where the normal rules of society don't apply, where you have to do things differently. You're never quite sure what makes justified violence, and often you have to use violence, you have to use force in order to have justice, so that then there can be civilization. So again, the idea of the frontier, this space between civilization and savagery. And of course you can hear here there's kind of an inherent really inherent racism about what existed before Western civilization, right? And the spread of the United States across the West and displacing the Native Americans that were there before. It's true in many Westerns, at least early Westerns, the Native Americans are aligned with savagery versus the anglicized immigrants that are moving across the West. But pretty quickly, at least by the 1950s, you see flips of that relationship where the people that are displacing Indians are instead actually shown to be the savage ones. And it doesn't have to be Indians that are aligned with savagery. It quite often is outlaws, and you might not even have Native Americans in it at all. Okay, so I'm getting more in the Western than I really need to, but this is kind of key to it. The notion that you have to have force for justice and that justice is so important, and that's definitely important going into Blazing Saddles. So the Western genre has conventions that have to do in those different categories that we see parodies target. Conventions of lexicon, syntax, and style. Remember, lexicon being those building blocks, those defining terms, the kinds of characters that you have, the kinds of setting, and even like props and things of that nature. Syntax being the narratives and plots, the way those different building blocks are put in order. And then style, the way that we see things or hear things, right? So with Western, we're used to big, wide open shots, big landscape shots, music that evokes that kind of solitude. Those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. All that stuff provides rich material for parody. Okay, so I'm going to finish up now with a nod toward theory, which is thinking about the notion of the sign. All right, so the sign is a unit of meaning, and we think about this in terms of seeing or hearing things, and those things coordinate with our notion in our mind of them signifying or meaning something. Okay? So the sign consists of two different pieces. The signifier, that's the image or the words that we see, and the signified, that's what that means to us. Okay? Those things together, it's those two things together that equal the sign. Now, the thing is that signs are produced culturally, right? When we see things, they have both what we call denotations and connotations. Denotations are the literal meaning. Connotations are really the socially, culturally produced meanings. So, as an example, take the hat, the cowboy hat, right? So when any of us see a hat that looks like either of these things we see in the two bottom pictures, that reads to us as a cowboy hat, right? Now, the connotations have then to do with, well, what do we associate that with? Do we have positive, negative connotations? Do we see that as being something that obnoxious rednecks wear? Do we see that as something that courageous, brave men or women wear? Or do we see that as something as that music performers we do or don't like wear? What are the connotations that we bring to that based on it? And I'm using these ads here because they show us a famous example of how signs from the Western were used to rebrand a product. So Marlboro cigarettes, back in the 20s and 30s, they were actually marketed as being a woman's cigarette. And then after the Second World War, they were rebranded to have these connotations of ruggedness as a rugged, manly cigarette. And they did that through associating them and using ad images like we see here of, you guessed it, the cowboy, right? So the idea again here is that we see in this case how the connotations of the cowboy in the Western are used to associate masculinity with these particular cigarettes, right? If cowboys in our culture of the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s didn't associate the cowboy with this rugged masculinity, it would not be used by Marlboro to rebrand their cigarettes, okay? So we have these kinds of signs established, and there's a cliche from the earliest Westerns, right? If we see somebody with a black hat, that equals a bad guy, versus the white hat, good guy. Now, that is a cliche, right? That really does not continue to hold. But that is a good example of really something that was established very early on in cinema and how a sign can work. And what parody does is it plays with those relationships between signifiers and signifieds. It knows that we have these kinds of connotations, and then it can flip those. It can invert those connotations. It can play with them. And so that's what we see in parody, is a lot of play between signifiers and signifieds. Those conventions that we expect, and then how they are comically inverted or transformed in parody.